Hi, Cheke. This week we're going to do a short video lecture on the War of 1812 from Myaamia perspective. Fingers crossed that I can keep it fairly short. We're going to start by talking about the usual story of the War of 1812. So if you're looking at a Wikipedia entry or reading a typical high school history book or even a typical college history book, you oftentimes get this picture of the War of 1812. That the story of the war usually begins with the declaration of war in June of 1812. And they list usually 3 causes for the United States to declare war against Great Britain. All 3 of these causes are tied to an international war taking place between Great Britain and France. This is during what people call the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon is trying to conquer all of Europe, and the British are the main resistor to those efforts. The first cause that the United States lists in their declaration of war are the impressments at sea, in which the British Navy was taking American sailors, American citizens, and taking them from American ships and forcing them to join the British Navy, or in some cases forcing them to rejoin the British Navy. It's a pretty complex issue we don't have time to go into today, but from the American perspective, American citizens were being taken and forced into service in the British Navy. The second cause was what people call the Orders in Council, a series of regulations, trade regulations that the British passed that made it very difficult for American ships to trade effectively with France, as well as any other nation allied with France. And this was viewed as an impugnment of U.S. sovereignty. Freedom of the seas was being blocked. And the third cause, the one most directly tied to our ancestors' lives, was frontier violence. As settlers began to move into the lands that we and other tribes ceded in the treaties from 1795 to 1809, those settlers came into contact with peoples, especially peoples who lived farther west, who hadn't participated in those treaties, and who viewed those treaties as completely illegitimate from their perspective. And that contact a lot of times produced violence. People were killed. And Americans believed that the British were urging these attacks on and providing supplies, guns, ammunition to make these attacks, and even paying scalp bounties, rewards for scalps brought back from these attacks. And while certainly the British were providing supplies, and in some cases were trying to maintain relationships with tribal peoples, they didn't actually want a full-scale war in the West. So a lot of this was conspiracy theory and warmongering by people who became known as war hawks, who were trying to agitate for war in the West. Usually in the story, it's depicted as, once the war begins, the United States and army and militias against Great Britain and its Indian allies. And we'll see in a second how that's not completely true, the way this is depicted. They're actually Native American allies, tribal peoples on both sides of this battle, both sides of this war. In many cases, it became a civil war between and among tribes and between and among Americans and British citizens in what became Canada. The first year of the war is usually depicted as a huge disaster for the Americans, as the forts in Michigan, Michilimackinac, the Fort Dearborn falls, Epicaneta, William Wells dies there, and then Fort Wayne is laid siege to in the fall of 1812, and the entire American army surrenders at Detroit. So it's a really disastrous year for the Americans. The second year of the war, things begin to turn around for the Americans, a lot of victories. In 1813, Tecumseh is actually killed, and most of the British army is defeated. But in the following year, the Americans are unsuccessful in terms of, in 1814, in terms of capturing Canada, which was one of the war hawks' major goals, to add Canada basically to the United States. And victories start to swing back for the British, so much so that actually the British successfully invade Washington, D.C., and burn many important governmental buildings in D.C. They don't hold D.C., but they attack it, destroy a lot of it, and then leave. That leads in December of 1814 to the Peace of Ghent, negotiated over in Europe between the British and the United States. And it's a peace with no real consequences. Status quo ante bellum is the term they use, status quo prior to the war, so that all the borders return back to the way they were. No one basically won or lost anything. All the lives expended and homes destroyed are basically viewed as just, that's the price of doing business for war, and everyone's supposed to go back to business as usual. This is, of course, not true for our ancestors and other tribal peoples, but from United States and British perspective, the slate was back to the way it was before the war. News takes a lot of time to travel across the Atlantic, and so news of the peace didn't reach the United States until after Andrew Jackson successfully captured New Orleans in 1815 for the Americans, which is an important victory for the Americans and an important piece of territory to gain control over at the mouth of the Mississippi. And it also begins Andrew Jackson's rise to real prominence in the United States as a figure of importance, which has negative consequences for tribal peoples in the 1830s because he is a major proponent of Indian removal. Now, if we take a look at the war from a Myaamia perspective, its beginning points are a little bit different, and how one perceives participation in the war is actually quite different than the broader narrative. The war for a lot of Myaamia people, as well as other tribal people, really begins in the fall of 1811 with an attack on a village at Tippecanoe, which our leaders desperately tried to prevent. We didn't have any people living there, but we wanted to keep violence from happening at Tippecanoe. And how we get to that attack at Tippecanoe, what people call the Battle of Tippecanoe, with William Henry Harrison attacking Prophetstown there, actually extends back to the Treaty of 1809, maybe even a little bit before that, and the rise of a younger group of young men who really were against the land treaties that were being signed after the Treaty of Greenville, and against the cession of land in which they felt their people also had a right to decide whether the land was ceded, and they were excluded from those negotiations, and felt that no individual tribe or even a group of 3 or 4 tribes should be ceding land that belongs, in their view, to everybody. And this is, of course, hotly contested, as ownership of land really wasn't viewed as completely collective among all the tribes by Myaamia people or Delaware people or Potawatomi people, but some did think it was. And this really began under the leadership of Tenskwatawa, here pictured in the center from a painting done by Catlin, and his brother Tecumseh on the left here. And this image is actually somewhat invented. There is no good image of Tecumseh actually from the historical record, but it's sort of the most common image people use. And these 2 brothers organized a village actually on the site of the original Treaty of Greenville that began to attempt to return to what they called older ways, rejecting a lot of the trade goods that came in and rejecting what they felt was dependency then on European goods, which was leading to a lot of these treaties, and rejecting many other facets of what they saw as illegitimate cultural changes going on among Shawnee people as well as others. And they drew a following from a lot of different tribal communities, especially among young men, but also women. And then families came to live at the village who saw a path forward through returning to older ways, what people call a revitalization movement. Of course, how they imagined these older ways, which hadn't existed within their lifetime, follows parallels with a lot of other revitalization movements. They sort of imagined this golden age of the past that never really existed, but they wanted to try and return to it. Eventually, that village at Greenville really struggled to feed itself, and they picked up and moved to Katepequanasipiwe, to the Tippecanoe River, right near a historic village site for the Miamis, pretty close to Lafayette, Indiana today, and built a village there that came to be called Prophetstown. The Americans called Tenskwatawa the prophet, which was a denigrating term because it was implied that he was a false prophet. Much of his movement was structured on a vision that he reportedly had about returning to these old ways, and so he was seen as a false prophet. And they moved this village there and began to build really solid connections with a lot of Western Potawatomi and Kickapoo and some Winnebago, originally from Wisconsin. And these are the groups that were responsible for a lot of the frontier violence. They lived somewhat distant from the main population centers of the United States, but were coming into contact with these small groups of settlers in what would become Illinois and Indiana, and in many cases killing these groups who they viewed were illegitimately settling on their lands. And so the U.S. government, William Henry Harrison and others, began to perceive Prophetstown as sort of the center of this intrigue and potentially leading a series of much larger attacks on the United States to try and push the frontier back. So they were quite worried about this. And they saw it in many ways as sort of the beginnings of a general Indian conspiracy, and perceiving that maybe all the tribes were going to follow Tecumseh. And our leaders tried to make very clear that our older men and our younger men were not supporting Tecumseh, and that in fact he and Tenskwatawa had moved to Prophetstown without being invited, and that was our land. They shouldn't be there. When Mishikanakwa tried to stop Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa from going there, Tenskwatawa told Mishikanakwa, our leader, that we didn't have the right to stop him, that the Great Spirit told him he could move there, and we weren't allowed to stand in his way. And so as things became very tense, and it became very clear that Harrison was contemplating an attack on Prophetstown, our leaders in the fall of 1811, prior to the attack, very clearly pleaded to try and make sure it didn't happen. You see here this quote from Mishikanakwa from Little Turtle, that we pray you not to bloody our ground. While he didn't like Tenskwatawa or Tecumseh and didn't want them there, he didn't necessarily want his elder brothers, the Shawnee, killed there. He didn't want violence to occur because he understood that, first of all, that would harm our relationships with our tribal relatives, and the violence could spread very quickly and engulf our communities as well. And he just reiterated to Harrison that we tried to stop him from going there. He's there without our leave. He's not our ally in terms of his agenda regarding the Americans. Unfortunately, his advice or his actions to try and stop the violence didn't bear fruit. When Harrison made his trip, numerous Myaamia leaders went with him to try and serve as intermediaries, sort of marching at the head of the army, and went to Tenskwatawa and tried to negotiate a peaceful end to the conflict. And as we don't have time to dive into in terms of more detailed accounts, they were unable to mediate that conflict, and the battle happened on November 7th, 1811, near daylight, right before dawn. It was actually a fairly close battle. More recent histories of it have said that if Tenskwatawa's villagers hadn't run out of ammunition, they may have actually forced Harrison's army to leave the field. But as the sun came up, most of the peoples surrounding Harrison's camp had to fall back because they ran out of ammunition. So Harrison claimed victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe, burned the whole village, and forced that group of people to leave. To the best of our knowledge, no Myaamia men fought against Harrison that day. There may have been a few Piankashaw men participating together with Tenskwatawa's villagers, but that doesn't seem certain. That following spring, in May of 1812, there was a council held at the Mississinewa, actually, at the Myaamia Council House outside what is today Peru, Indiana, and Tecumseh actually came there. This is really close. The council house was potentially very close to where the Godfrey Cemetery is today, outside Peru, Indiana. And at that meeting, it's a really interesting meeting. You see very clearly that most of the elder leaders completely disagree with Tecumseh, and they castigated him roundly, criticized him heavily for what happened at Tippecanoe, for not restraining his people. And Tecumseh wasn't there, so he blamed in part his brother, and he also blamed the Potawatomis. He said, it wasn't my fault, the Potawatomis were being too aggressive, which becomes this weird running theme throughout the War of 1812 that everybody blames the Potawatomis for everything. So the council is recorded, the transcripts reported to the United States. Very clearly, everyone there does not support Tecumseh, and they recognize, Mishikanakwa says, we recognize that war is not an option for us. To fight against the United States means the wholesale destruction of our villages. So unlike those Western Potawatomi people, the Winnebagos and the Kickapoo, who live more distant from Americans, we have forts next to all of our major villages, or within a day's march of all our villages. Our leaders knew if we, raised our hand in violence, the soldiers would pour out of these forts and destroy our lives. They had lived through the wars of the 1780s and 1790s and didn't want to experience that again. Despite all of this, war is declared in June of 1812. And within a month, Mishikanakwa, our most established leader, dies at Fort Wayne in July of 1812. His son-in-law, Epikaneta, major translator as well as a co-leader of our efforts at adaptive resistance, he dies in August of 1812 at the Battle of Fort Dearborn. And in the immediate aftermath or while the frontier is actually collapsing, the Americans call for a peace council at Piqua in August. And Myaamia people originally planned on attending this peace council to demonstrate our continued desire for peace in the United States. But while en route to the council, word came of the fall of Fort Dearborn and that there were British allied American Indians, Native Americans, descending on Fort Wayne and our villages. And so they turned around and returned to the Fort Wayne area to evacuate our villages. And that's the beginning of the siege of Fort Wayne from the end of August through early September of 1812. And Tecumseh sent a message to the Myaamia, again, a sign that we were not allied with him, we're not allied with the British, that we need to get out of the way lest we be crushed beneath his boot. And so while he wasn't going to attack us, he expected us to get out of the way while he attacks the Americans. Similarly, there's a siege at Fort Harrison down the Wabash in September of 1812. And there's pretty good evidence that Wea and Piankashaw men participated in this particular siege. And so depending on whether you perceived those men as Myaamia or not, you could make a decision as a leader in the time period whether the Myaamia were now belligerents. As I said in class this week, around 1804, 1805, it became very clear that the Piankashaw and Wea were politically independent from the Myaamia, though they shared the same language and culture. And by 1812, this was very much the case. So I would say from a Myaamia perspective, leadership from Myaamia villages from the Eo River north had no control over what those men were doing. And our young men in the Fort Wayne area did not participate in the violence against the Americans. Despite this, as Mishikanakwa feared, our entire world goes up in flames during the war. When the siege of Fort Wayne is lifted by William Henry Harrison, there's massive retaliation. All the Fort Wayne area villages, Turtletown, Mishikanakwa's village, and the Forks of Wabash village, our largest village in the time period, were burned, as well as all of our stored food supplies. This occurred in early September of 1812. A lot of refugees fled north and west, some going to the Peoria, Illinois area, and those villages were attacked in October of 1812. And then many or most of the refugees fled south to the Mississinewa villages, from basically the confluence of the Mississinewa with the Wabash all the way south along the Mississinewa Valley itself to near Marion, Indiana today. There was a series of villages. And these villages were attacked in December of 1812, and 3 of 4 of them were burned, although the invading group is eventually forced to flee due to a Myaamia counterattack. And really the militant response to Campbell's campaign in December of 1812 is the first clear evidence of Myaamia violence against the Americans, and it comes pretty clearly in self-defense. And then in July of 1813, in the summer of 1813, another campaign comes up the Wabash, what's called Russell's Campaign, and basically burns all the villages that Campbell didn't get to in the winter of 1812. The Eel River Village, everything on the Wabash, everything on the Mississinewa is burned out again. Most of the people flee, so they're not captured or killed, but all of our homes and foodstuffs are destroyed, just like during the wars of the 1780s and 90s. This left Myaamia people in a position that they describe after the war as in a position where they're no longer at liberty to choose, that they tried to stay neutral, not choose sides, not fight for the Americans, not fight for the British, and that they felt that Harrison told them, just like Tecumseh told them, to get out of the way. As long as you stay out of the way, you'll be fine. So they did that. They felt that moving to the Mississinewa was getting out of the way. And despite doing that, they were attacked at every turn. And so at that point, it's very clear that hundreds of young Myaamia men join the British and fight against the Americans. Now, there's some evidence that they didn't join with Tecumseh, and so that a lot of the anger and resentment voiced by Mishikanakwa was still felt within the community. And instead, they joined with a Wyandot war leader named Roundhead. He was affiliated with Tecumseh, but that they really served under his leadership and didn't work directly with Tecumseh. In any event, their participation as a British ally was pretty short. By the fall or winter of 1813, they're sort of in things, and by the fall of the next year, by October of 1813, they're suing for peace with Harrison. Right before actually the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh dies, some Myaamia leaders make an initial foray for peace, and then immediately following that battle, which basically marks the end of the ability of tribal peoples to make attacks into the United States. They're mostly on the defensive inside of Canada. They sign an armistice with Harrison at Detroit, and this was largely negotiated by Pakana. And then in the following summer of 1814, they negotiate the second Treaty of Greenville. It was called the Peace of Greenville in 1814. And we don't have time to go into it today in my efforts to keep this video somewhat shorter. This was a stark contrast to the initial Treaty of Greenville. And at this treaty, people are really silenced, and the Americans feel like they need to put people in their place. And when Myaamia leaders talk about what happened to them and describe being basically put between a rock and a hard place, the American leaders basically tell them to sit down and shut up, and that's not true, that they were allies of the British and belligerents, and this is the consequence of being a belligerent. So it's a pretty terrible swing of the pendulum in terms of what happened when negotiating treaties prior to the War of 1812. So the War of 1812, more so really than even the wars in the 1790s, was a catastrophic experience for Myaamia people. It represented the absolute failure of the leadership of the older generation, Mishikanakwa, Pakana, Epikhaneta, where they had tried through those early treaties to lay the groundwork for adaptation and change in the community, and that the community largely rejected it, especially the younger men and young women. And that this built resentment in our community as well as other communities that eventually led to war. And it's the young men who eventually, really wanted to fight against the Americans. In class next week, we'll get a chance to talk about the Battle of the Mississippi in more detail. Those young men hadn't lived through or were very young in the wars of the 1790s, so they had no idea what they were in for. But the War of 1812 really left us in desperate and desolate conditions. So we come back to this image of the Myaamia burial ground and the grave house of Nuhkemena, of Captain Flower, and the phrase "Shakwate Yange," our hearts are mourning or are crushed and burned, was sort of definitely representative of the experience coming out of this war. That following the first Treaty of Greenville through the Treaty of 1809, there was hope of a kind of change by which we could find a way to thrive and not melt away like the snow before the vernal sun. And instead, we're drawn into a war in which many of our people die, and what we have been able to maintain, our homes, our farm fields, our stored food production, are all destroyed. And we're brought to the treaty table again in really desperate circumstances. And yet, out of that comes a new kind of effort that focuses on adaptive resistance that the community this time supports. So leadership begins to develop even more strategies for adapting and changing to resist the oppression of the Americans. And this time, the community is much more supportive of that. So Mishinewe, looks like I kept it around the 20-minute mark. And look forward to talking more about this in class this week. Anyway, Shia.